right, everybody, welcome to Pastor to Pastor episode 14, and we're with my friend from college. I have a lot of old friends in the ministry, which is pretty cool, Scott Dinkins, and Scott is our second Presbyterian, so that's pretty cool. So, Scott, you want to tell a little bit about your calling and ministry? Scott actually grew up Southern Baptist, so you might want to get into that a little bit, maybe how God led you out of a Southern Baptist church into a Presbyterian church, and then maybe your call to Chapin Presbyterian where you are now.
Sure. Yeah, I did grow up Southern Baptist and still have all of my family are basically Southern Baptist. I got a brother who's a career missionary with the IMB. And so my mom and dad and sister and her husband still are Southern Baptists. So I'm kind of like the theological black sheep of my family in that way. But the way the short story is, the way that played out in my life was I guess it was more the age of life that I was in when the Lord started to get a hold of my heart and make me interested in scripture and theological things, was the time in our country where the young, restless, and reformed movement was starting in the early 2000s, and so whatever I was reading, whether it was online or books, it was all kind of with a slant towards Reformed theology or sovereign grace. And so I started to investigate that and read it, and started, of course I was reading the Bible too, and it started to just kind of match up. And I was like, well, I didn't know anything about Southern Seminary. I knew nothing about the term Reformed Baptist at all. And so I just thought that there was a clear break between, Southern Baptist theology and Presbyterianism or Reformed theology. And, of course, now looking back, I see there's quite a bit of overlap there. But nonetheless, that was the slow progression. I ended up going to a non-denominational seminary. I went to Columbia International University in Columbia, and had a mix of professors, Arminian and Reformed there. But a lot of the student body was, they were heading towards the mission field, but they were in kind of that conversational movement I was in, and we were thinking in Reformed ways. And the church I started going to was a Reformed church here in Columbia, or there in Columbia. I'm in Chapin now, but so nonetheless, that's how that transition happened. And then you also asked me about how I got this call to Chapin Presbyterian Church. So I'll transition and fast forward some. I spent 11 years on staff at Christ Covenant Church. It was Christ Church of the Carolinas. And in the course of those 11 years, towards the end, we ended up merging and becoming a PCA church. We planted or replanted a new church. We merged with another church that was already PCA, and that was Covenant Presbyterian Church. We were Christ Church, and we merged to form Christ Covenant Church. And so in that process, I had been ordained independently by my group of my elders at Christ Church. And that was in 2014 when I was ordained the first time. And and then when we merged with Covenant PCA Church, I began the process of being ordained as a PCA teaching elder, a pastor in the PCA. And so that process took a little bit of time, but then in the course of that, this position up here opened up, and I came up here to preach just pulpit supply type stuff because I was an associate and I was available. And then once the search team formed up here, which was not long after I had been up here to fill the pulpit, they asked if I would consider becoming one of the applicants. I was, and I did, and then that's how it kind of unfolded. And so that would have been summer of 2019. And then I actually came to Chapin the middle of February of this year, and was here for about 4 or 5 weeks in the pulpit, and then COVID happened.
Wow.
And it's been such a joy.
We'll get into that in a second with the COVID. I was thinking as you were telling me about this, you were on staff as an associate for 11 years, and I remember you being there, and I was in Columbia probably around the same time for a couple of years there. Um, Now, what advice would you have for guys that have been like an associate or pastor kind of deal for, even in the long term, and then they feel the call to be the senior pastor lead guy, which is, as you know, is a different role clearly. And in a lot of these interviews, I'm only interviewing senior lead pastors because it's just a different perspective on things. And and we can debate and talk about how the unique calling of that as well. I think there is a unique calling there for each church. So, but talk a little bit about that transition, that mindset, not necessarily how, and we understand, like, we agree that the Lord called you in there, but just mentally, some of the things that you've had to start thinking through, praying through, that you would tell people if they're really thinking about going this route, what are some things they need to think about before doing that?
That's a really good question. I had an inkling for a while that I could be an associate for the rest of my career,
Yeah.
and fit that niche and be kind of in that mold. And then the further down the road I got experientially, I began to start to think about and talk about with my senior pastor at the time what it would look like to transition to that role.
Mm-hmm.
And his counsel was important to me in that regard. I think that would be key
Mm-hmm.
to somebody who is an associate and thinking about the possibility of moving to a senior role or a lead pastor role. It is a very different role. It's the responsibility changes. You become one of the primary decision makers, if not the primary decision maker, depending on
Yeah.
the breakup or the breakdown of the church leadership that you're becoming, or you're taking over,
Yeah.
so to speak. So that's an important piece of the puzzle, is having conversations with folks in your church that know you and can see you from a different perspective than you see yourself. Self-awareness is really key, but then also having wise counsel from those who've seen your giftedness, who've watched you in ministry, and can say, yeah, here's some things that you're not good at that you need to know about yourself, and
Yeah.
either improve or just be upfront with the potential church you could go to and say, hey, this is an area that I need
Yeah.
support, and this is an area where I feel really comfortable. And having that conversation, I think one of the things, thinking about moving towards a senior position, we think, oh, well, I'm going to take the first opportunity that comes, and
Yeah.
that's actually one of the worst things you can do.
Yeah.
That's one of the things I think that causes pastoral turnover, is that we just look for an open job and we apply for it, and then we jump into it without thinking about the realities that each church is a little different and
Yeah.
each pastor is a little different, and we need to kind of match up and be honest about where my strengths and weaknesses are. And if that doesn't fit that church, then be good with that. Remove yourself from consideration, or be good when they tell you, you know what, your giftedness doesn't really fit what we need right
Yeah.
now.
That's right.
And then trust the Lord. Don't try to, ram a square peg
Yeah.
into a round hole. It's going to end badly. So, the jury's still out in a lot of ways. I've been here for, a little over 7 months, and it really has been a joy relationally. The COVID stuff has presented a lot of challenges, and so, leadership learning on the fly. But the good news is none of us have really known how to
No.
navigate the system, because it's so, unique and strange. So anyway, I would encourage an associate thinking about becoming a lead pastor to lean on the influence and the insight of um, their senior pastor and other leaders in their church that have been around and know them well and can give good godly counsel regarding strengths and weaknesses and potentials.
That's good. It's good. And when you're younger, that might be a little harder too. You made this decision. Obviously you're older when you made this decision. And I'm talking about like when you're mid 20s, that kind of thing. you might be more apt to just to jump into something. And so that's good advice for people. When I was a children's pastor, I was very happy where I was, and doing what I thought was a pretty good job and doing well. And when I told my pastor, who's of course Dr. Eastep, I was feeling called to preach specifically, and he's like, "You can't leave." Like, why would you want to do that? And but for me, it was more like I had this burden I had to preach. It was really a call to preach more than anything. I never had that. I went through all of seminary, never had that at all. Never had that inkling. And so I understand the urge to want to jump into something, especially when it's like, hey, I really have this, urge to do this, or this feeling or call. And so that's good advice. And the fit thing is an issue. We talk a lot about fit, and sometimes God might call you somewhere where you're not a fit for a purpose. But overall, generally speaking, it is a marriage in many ways, and it helps. Go ahead.
The other thing I would encourage a younger associate to think through or to consider is just the patience of waiting on God's timing.
Yeah.
If you're not willing to do that, you can get frustrated. The grass can seem greener. The old cliche can prove to be true in our lives that because we're thinking about another position, we lose sight of the calling that we have here, which is to serve this particular body and love these particular people, and let the Lord season us with experience until He pushes us forward into another place where we can serve and love the people there. But sometimes we get caught up in a timeline. Well, I need to be this by the time I'm 35, and I need to be this by the time I'm 40. And it's like, a lot of that is not necessarily bad, but it can taint the focus of ministry in the place that we are.
Very good. Very good. Scott, some of you may know Scott has 6 children, and I have 4, so he's got me beat pretty well there. And so I know the challenges of pastoring a church and being married. We can't forget we're married as well. We have a wife and we have 4 children. So I know the challenges in balancing that. And I live very close to the church, so it's very nice. I'm able to come home here and there, and if I need to, that kind of thing, which my wife loves, of course. But let's talk a little bit about balancing family with ministry calling. And if there's anybody out there who knows they have to, it would be someone with 6 children, and you can't just ignore. And maybe 1 child, 2 children, you can just kind of unintentionally ignore. You really can't do that with 6. And so I'm sure you've learned a lot, because your oldest is what, 13, 14 maybe?
That's right. She's 13.
Yeah, 14. Oldest is 14 too. And so maybe talk a little bit about those who have a lot of children, and obviously it does get a little easier in ways when they get older, but there's other challenges when they get older too. And so maybe talk a little bit about some of the wisdom you've learned just about balancing those 2 things.
Having a lot of kids, one of the things that we are asked from time to time is, how do you do it?
Yeah.
And our answer to that question is, whatever you think it is, we aren't doing that. We're not, this amazing model family that just gets everything right all the time. And unfortunately, that's the way pastors and their families are viewed in some places. And so what I say to folks up front is that, marriage was one of the hardest things I have ever done. And then I thought that it was, going great. And then we found out we were expecting. And parenting is even more difficult than marriage. And the Lord uses these seasons in our lives to expose our sin and to show areas where we're so selfish and caring and thinking only about our own interests. But for me, one of the main goals in parenting, I'll just deal with that for a second.
Yeah.
Parenting, my goal is to win the hearts of my children. I want to expose them to God's word, and I want to teach them hymns, and I want to, have them memorizing verses, and I want to win their hearts. I want to love them and share a relationship of mutual respect and devotion,
Yeah.
because um, that's one of the things that I want to share with them for a lifetime. And so, um, pastorally, if I'm wed to my job or my meetings or the growth of my church or the strength of my leadership or my giving or whatever else we can focus on with our time and talents and resources, how good my sermons are, et cetera. If I let that take precedent over just winning the hearts of my children, then I'm going to watch them leave the church eventually, and that may happen down the road. The jury's still out.
Yeah.
They're the oldest is 13, my youngest is 14 months, and so there's a lot that I haven't seen. There's a lot that I don't know when it comes to parenting older children. And I've seen, I've been in student ministry for enough of my career to see students leave the faith or at
Yeah.
least walk away from the church for a season. Um, and so part of that, kind of gives me the shivers when I think about my children potentially doing that. But I know at the end of the day, the Lord is in all of the details of their lives. He's sovereignly controlling all of their days. And so, I rest in that. And I trust him to grow within them a heart of faith and love towards him and neighbors. And so one of the prayers that I pray over them regularly is, Lord, just grant them your grace and love, love them, pour your love out in their lives so that that love that you give them would overflow. I mean, we love because he first loves us. And so that's what I pray for them. And honestly, we just take it one day at a time. I mean, parenting and preaching are the two hardest things I've ever done.
Yeah.
And probably in that order. It's just such a challenge, and it keeps us humble. And then I ask people to, show my kids grace, because I know sometimes preachers' kids have a lot of pressure on them
Yeah.
behaviorally, because everybody's like, well, look at that, and you look at what the preacher's kid did. At the end of the day, they're just like I was when I was 13, 14, 15.
Yeah.
I'm thankful my daddy wasn't a preacher because
Yeah,
because
that's right.
for sure.
It's really good. I'm just thankful that when I'm 57 years old and my youngest is graduating high school, you'll also be 57 with your youngest graduating high school. So I won't be the only one.
Age is just a number, Charlie.
That's right. You're right. Anyhow, it is a lot physically that I can tell a difference in having a baby now, 20-month-old now, than when Jackson was a baby. There's a physical difference.
Yeah.
And those other children help, but it's not the same.
Babies are for young people, for sure.
Yes, they are. And I don't know if you feel this way, because there's not as big of a gap in the middle like we have. I think it's a 6 or 7 year gap from three to 4. But we feel almost like grandparents to the baby. Do you feel that way a little bit, almost like more patient? What I mean by that is more patient to the baby, more loving than maybe you were with your first 2 children?
Well, I don't know. That's a good question. There's a 4-year gap for us, and this baby is a little different than some of our other children that were perhaps easier babies. You hear that term?
Yeah, oh, I know what you mean.
This little girl has not been easy.
Yeah.
And she's a bundle of energy, so she moves more than some of our others.
Same.
We've got 5 girls and 1 boy, and my boy was a climber. He was all over everything, and we were like, okay, yeah, he's different. He's a boy.
Yeah.
But she's very much like he was. We have to lay chairs down and around our kitchen table so that she's not constantly climbing up on them and then onto the table to get whatever it is she wants up there, or to just hang out and maybe fall off. So we just have to be cognizant of stuff we've never had to be cognizant of before, because she's just different. So I don't know that I'm more patient with her. I call her my little tornado, because she's just constantly into stuff and messing with stuff, and maybe frustrating me more than other kids did. I don't know. It's all a little different.
That's interesting. That's interesting you say that, because each child, starting from 1 to 4, each child has been more active than the previous one. I wish it would have been the other way around, but it goes back to God kind of humbling us, right?
Yeah. keeping us on our knees for
I'm the
sure.
most laid back boy that you could possibly have. Then I have an average little girl. Then I have an active little girl, and now I have an active little boy. And so it's I know what you mean by that. Really cool. Yeah, and it's amazing with I don't know how your children are with like sermon illustrations and things like that. Like I have, and we can talk about whether or not you should even have your children in sermon illustrations, that kind of thing. But people like to hear stories. If it connects, you're helping people understand if it connects. But some of my children do not want to be talked about at all. Never talk about me, Dad. Then I have another one that's like, please talk about me every week. And so it's like you have to balance that, and you don't really want to give them. You don't, and the one that wants to be talked about, you don't really want to do that all the time either. So, how do you when you talk about dealing with children and ministry life? There's some safeguards you kind of put up, and you talk about giving your kids grace, or there's some, are there some areas that you safeguards, and then there's some areas where you just tell them don't worry about.
Well, I have maybe some guidelines I try to keep, and I call them guidelines rather than rules because I've probably broken them before, and not meant to, but just overstep some boundaries. I don't believe I've ever called out any of my kids by name as far as an illustration goes.
Yeah.
And if I think it might embarrass them, I'll say one of my children.
Yeah, I've done that.
Rather than
I've done that.
rather than Tess or Sarah Knox or Benjamin. But I will say that there's been a couple times when I was at my previous church, and I was preaching in the evenings. We had a smaller crowd, and there were certain times where my wife was sick or had a sick kid at the house, and so me and just some of my kids came, and they would sit on the front row, and they didn't have anybody with them, adult-wise. So there was a couple times where I had to be like, "Hey," from the pulpit, be like, "Y'all need to be quiet," and they don't expect me to do that, so they straighten up pretty quick. But that's usually when they're younger. Obviously, I'm not doing that with a 10-year-old. I'm doing that with a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old. So they have no memory of it. So they're not like scarred by the time that Dad called me down while we were, in the pew. Yeah. But as far as just in general, especially if Sandy's involved, I usually don't tell any stories on her without checking,
Absolutely. No, that's true.
Or I
learned that the hard way.
I rarely use my family as an illustration, honestly.
Yeah.
I might talk about a habit we have, or one of the things that we do in a positive way, but I'm rarely ever using, like a teachable moment from our house as a sermon illustration.
Yeah. Yeah. It's good.
As a guide.
Yeah, I understand. That's good. That's good. Let's talk a little bit about Chapin. Now, Chapin is basically it's starting to become kind of like suburban Columbia area, metropolitan area. But I mean, 20 years ago, they wouldn't probably consider themselves that, I wouldn't think. But maybe now they would. And I actually worked in Chapin for a little bit, so I'm a little familiar with the area. Tell me a little bit about Chapin and how it's different. Every city, town has its own peculiarities, how it's different than just the Columbia area, and then what's unique about it, and making disciples in Chapin, and what some of the idols that you kind of go against and that kind of thing.
Sure. So first I'll talk about the positives of Chapin. I mean, it's a fantastic place to live. It's a really good place to raise a family. There's a growing population because people are moving out here to be in a good school district. We've got great teachers. We've got really good administrators. So there's a lot of positives around the school system. Mm-hmm. And then, we're up close to Lake Murray. So there's a lot of, it's just a pretty place to live. You've got lake access. You're kind of getting out of the Midlands a little bit. Yeah. Columbia seems so hot and sweltering. And this first summer in Chapin, it wasn't necessarily cooler, but we've seen, that we're a little bit closer to the upstate. And maybe it's just that this September has been a little milder, but nonetheless, it's far enough away where you don't feel like you're in Columbia, but you're close enough to it where you can feel the growth moving this way.
Yeah.
So that's in a sense, it's a really small town. I mean, the city of Chapin is actually only just a couple of miles in
Yeah.
circumference, and the population is small because of that. But the surrounding area, the zip code of you know Lexington County and even into Newberry a little bit, people would say, "Yeah, I live in Chapin," but they're actually just in the outskirts of the town, the city. Um, there's just a lot to do, a lot of pretty stuff to be engaged with. They got really good um, activity center, a park with all kinds of organization when it comes to, little league, soccer, baseball,
Yeah.
and so on. So it's very community minded in that way. Now, for challenges, I'm still investigating some of that, but it can be an affluent culture, and
Mm-hmm.
with affluency comes, a host of sins, consumerism and materialism, a love of the world, um, covetousness, envy, gossip, slander, lust. So this is, kind of scratching the surface of idols. These are some of the things that are present in our schools. You've got the pressure to keep up. You've got, some of your peers might be going off to, private schools or Ivy League schools, and you got this pressure to keep up academically.
Mm-hmm.
Athletically, it's really grown. 20 years ago, it was a 2A high school or somewhere thereabouts, and now it's a 5A high school.
Wow.
And so, yeah, you're playing, the biggest schools in the state. And so there's a pressure there to just keep up and keep going. Um, and so mental health, depression, suicide, drug use, all of these things are present in our community because of the affluency. And then, um, there's other challenges associated with um, status and um, being aware. One of the things we lack, I think, in affluent cultures is an awareness that there's others around us who are not affluent. And we think, we need more, we've got to accrue more because there's always somebody who
Yeah.
has more than we do.
Yeah.
And there's actually a lot of folks who are in Chapin that have been here a long time, and they don't care anything about money. They just love to live here. This is their town. This is where they're from, and this is where they're going to raise their families, and this is where their kids are going to raise their kids. And so they're put off with the affluent pursuit.
Yeah.
So there's some division between the folks that are from here and have been around here and folks who've moved here. And learning how to minister to that is a challenge. And learning how to help develop a kingdom mindset in both areas, from the folks who've grown up here as well as the folks who've moved here, or transplants, if you will.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of challenges, but there's a lot of blessings too. Um, in my particular church, there's a great core group of folks who love this community and love this church, and they want to figure out how to pool their gifts to make the biggest impact for the kingdom here and around the world. And so we're just trying to figure out how to do that the best we can. And we're in the beginning stages of assessment, so to speak.
Yeah. You would have been further along if it wasn't for the pandemic, I'm sure.
Yeah, and that's funny. That's the joke I keep going with our leaders here is I put together 100-day plan for my first 100 days.
Yeah.
And it was, observing and getting to know elders and deacons and um, so on and so forth, going around to different groups that met. And
Yeah.
COVID hit and it changed all that. God took that 100-day plan and threw out the window. Of course, we think that, COVID is all about what God's teaching me.
That's right.
I mean, that's important, but there's so much more happening in the world than just me and this transition. So just trying to keep a healthy perspective of how to minister in these times.
Well, Chapin seems similar. A lot of similarities between Chapin and Moncks Corner. Complete with a lake. And we're both. I mean, we're 5 minutes from the lake, literally, and so similar situation. And there is the MoCo people who've been here, and then there's people coming in. So you do have that. Many people who are moving to Chapin, is it mainly people moving from other parts of Columbia, or just moving in from elsewhere, or is it both? Is it a little bit of both?
I would say it's both.
Yeah.
You do have, the lake is a draw for folks who want to retire and move to the lake.
Yeah.
So you see that happening, but you also see folks who are driving into town to work, and they want to get in a good school district, and so they're looking for that.
Yeah.
Whether they think that's in the Northeast or Lexington, or up here towards Chapin. And it's interesting. We don't have a really strong segment of young professionals. And so our 20 to 25-year-old, numbers are not very high at all.
Yeah.
I think a lot of that demographic wants to be in urban areas. They want to be in the city,
That's
whether
true.
that's an apartment or, a neighborhood close to downtown. And so what we see is that, like, older couples, couples in their, upper 20s, lower 30s, those are the folks that we see kind of moving out this way. And then, of course, a little bit older too, but it's a mix. So the retirement community can be from, around South Carolina or even up north. There's a lot of folks who've moved down from Ohio and New Jersey. We don't have a lot of those necessarily in our church, but I've seen that in my time.
Interesting.
It's a mix.
So, okay. So let's talk a little about COVID, and then we'll wind down here. So like you said, you were for about 4 weeks. So now are y'all worshiping again, correct? Are you worshiping again?
We are.
Okay. So when did that restart?
We restarted. Gracious, we probably restarted somewhere around Father's Day.
Okay.
Mid-June.
All right.
And we saw our numbers probably at about 30% then. And then it's kind of steadily grown. We were at 30% for several weeks, but it was always a different mix of people. So you knew you were probably at more like 40%.
Yeah.
Even though you only had 30% any given Sunday.
Yeah.
And then that kind of bumped up to 40 or 45%. We had a little spike in July that we saw numbers decline a little bit, spike in COVID numbers.
Oh.
And then now, as August has come and school has started, getting back in the swing of that kind of thing, we're probably up around the 55% or 60% now.
Yeah.
But again, it's a different percentage. It's a different mix of people each Sunday. So I would say we're probably running about 70 to 75% of folks back.
But that's where we are.
Yeah, it's really only 60% any given Sunday.
Yeah. Interesting.
But there are a group of our elderly that we love and try to stay in touch with, but no, they need to stay away right now because there's just so many unknowns about the virus.
That's right.
So we're encouraging them to stay that way.
Yeah.
And then we've got some younger families who have, maybe they have some pre-existing conditions in their children, or they're ministering or still around some of their elderly parents. And then some of them are just uncertain about the after effects, the side effects of this virus, even if they get it and they're completely healthy and survive it. So there's a different mix of folks who haven't yet come back.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, we've seen similar things with that. Yeah, that's good. What would you now I read an article here by Rayner recently that said that apparently he had talked to a bunch of pastors, and he didn't give any statistics, but something along the lines of a lot of pastors are just ready or this close to just quitting, just giving it up. Now you're in a different position because you're still new, right? And I'm going into my 8th year, and I certainly haven't felt that urge. And of course, we have a wonderful church and very supportive people here, and and I haven't felt that, but I can see where certain guys might feel that way. What pressures do you think pastors are having that's making them want to give up right now? What do you think that's coming from?
I would agree with you. So let me say first, I don't feel any kind of like scratching or knocking at the door as far as going and doing something else.
Yeah.
But I understand that pressure that some people describe. And I got a lot of respect for Tom Rayner and a lot of the research he does and the pulse that he keeps his finger on when it comes to pastors and churches. So I don't discount that at all. I do think that's possible. I would attribute it to working outside of your giftedness. And I think I felt that for sure working outside of my giftedness with COVID, because there's all kinds of decisions that we're called on to make that we've got no idea what the right or wrong answer is. And there really isn't a right or wrong answer. Whether we, space out pews or zigzag, or whether we, mask the whole time, or just, going and coming services. Do I mask while I'm preaching, or do we mask when we're singing, or, and then you throw into the mix all the political pressure of an election year and all of this racial tension that's come up through the riots and the George Floyd situation. That is just, it's grievous. And so it's a hard time to be a pastor because it's so different than some years where you're just kind of, preaching God's word and serving the sacraments and, serving, the Lord's Supper. And
I know what you mean.
It's just like a normal type of ministry. And this is like all at once. And to be asked to do what you're not good at and then get pushback on the decisions you've made in areas where you're not good or you're not gifted can be really exhausting.
Yeah, that's good.
So, if there are pastors who are ready to hang it up, I bet that's why.
Yeah, that's good. I've thought about that because so many pastors also, I believe, if you read the leadership books, a lot of times the pastor is supposed to be, hold on a second, I'm going to pause real quick. All right, I had a little visitor with my children, so we had to pause. But, you read the leadership books, and there's a lot of talk about, I feel like sometimes there's pressure that pastors should be like the CEO, and the pastor should be a salesman, and the pastor should be this, high caliber leader and all these kind of things. And when you talk about getting out of your giftedness, sometimes God's just called you to be a pastor, right? Biblically. And I think sometimes pastors put so much pressure on themselves to be literally what they're not called to be. And I wonder if some of that's been exposed in our COVID times. What do you think? Would you agree with something like that maybe?
Absolutely. Yeah. There are different kinds of pastors too. I think understanding that I'm not Charlie Wallace and you're not Scott Dinkins is really important, because you're going to have strengths. And the last pastor who was at your church is going to have strengths that your people recognize you don't have. But you also have strengths that he didn't have. And so understanding that at the end of the day, we're human and we're all a little different. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. As a matter of fact, that's how it's designed to be. And so we got to be really careful that we don't try to excel in areas where we're maybe not gifted to excel. Or if we're going to excel there, we're going to do it through help. So, I told the search team that called me straight up front, I said, I really do love God's word and I really enjoy preaching. I'm really bad at administration. And so dates and times and calendars are hard for me. So I need help there. I would need support there. And I think it's important that we as pastors are able to say, I'm really good at this. I like this. And I'm not really good at this. And I would need assistance and support there so that our church can, at the end of the day, if the church doesn't want to support the pastor, then you don't want to be there. But also they need to know where they can support you. And so it's important to be honest.
That's good. That's good. All right, we'll go ahead and wrap things up. Scott, anything else that you just learned in this season that you thought would be helpful or that you're working through for guys that may be watching?
I would say to have, and one of the benefits of Presbyterianism is that we have this, but have other ministers that you can call on. This is one reason why I think what you're doing, Charlie, is great, because it's important to get somebody on the telephone and say, hey, I'm
Mm,
dealing with this, or I'm trying to make this hire, or I've got this problem or question or idea for a sermon um, series. What do you think about this? Somebody that you can bounce it off of.
yeah.
And so it's good to have those resources to be able to pick up the phone and call and say, hey, help me out here. What do you think about this? Or give me some advice based on your experience. So think that way when you're developing relationships with other pastors. And then the other thing I would say is, and I'll close with this, I know you want to wrap up, is when you get to a place, wherever that is, wherever the Lord leads you, um, do take some time to get to know the churches around you and their pastors. Get some time with them, invite them to lunch, invite them to your office for coffee or to the local coffee shop. I've been able to do that in some cases here, and it's really been beneficial. I want to do more of it because it's all kind of um, drug out due to COVID. But I think that's important for the health of the community. And
Yeah.
it's important for other churches to know, hey, you know what? We're not in a competition.
Mm,
We're actually laboring together for the kingdom. Now, of course, I'm talking about, Bible preaching,
yeah.
you know, Bible believing churches,
Yeah.
but, we're laboring towards the same goal. Um, and I think it's healthy, and I think it's good for community engagement down the road to develop some of those relationships. So
Very
anyway,
good. All right, Scott, thank you. If you're in the Chapin area looking for like a good Bible, as you just said, preaching, Bible believing, Christ exalting church, Chapin Presbyterian. And what's the address out there?
we are at 600 Old Lexington Highway
All
in
right,
Chapin.
there it is, near the lake. All right, thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Charlie. Have a great rest of your weekend, my man.
All right.